Well, welcome everyone. My name is Amy Nelson, and I am the CEO and founder of the Riveter. I hope that everyone is staying safe, healthy, and finding small silver linings through these extremely difficult times. Although so many aspects of our lives are affected at this moment, it is a critical time for millions of working women and mothers in America. This global pandemic has brought to light inequalities that have existed for women in the service sector that should never have existed in the first place. Of the 10 million service workers who have lost their jobs due to the pandemic over the past 2 months, most of them are women, and many of them are single mothers. Unfortunately, this disparity only continues to grow, and it's up to us to act now and to fight for the change and equity for women everywhere. At the Riveter, we seek to elevate the voices of all working women and are proud to host this conversation as we advocate change. We don't want to go back to normal. We're ready for something different. It's up to us to act now and fight for the change and equity for women everywhere. And that's why I'm so grateful and honored to have Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton and Saru Jayaraman, the president of One Fair Wage, joining us today to tell us about the One Fair Wage Emergency Fund and the efforts to bring together the voices of service workers to achieve meaningful change. Because again, we cannot go back to the old normal. We all deserve better and we want better. As you know, Secretary Clinton has decades of experience advocating and fighting for working women and mothers. As a mother of 4 daughters myself, I'm so grateful for all the work you've done, Secretary Clinton. Her expertise is unparalleled. We're very excited to hear from her and how she thinks we can turn this pandemic into a catalyst for change. We're also excited to hear from my friend Saru, president of One Fair Wage. She is an amazing leader and longtime advocate for working women in the service sector. I want to say thank you to our partners, One Fair Wage, Time's Up, the United State of Women, and Emily's List. Without them, this event would not be possible. And finally, before we get started, we'd love for you to participate and ask your questions. You can submit questions via the Q&A icon if you hover down below. As questions come up for you, please write them in the Q&A box. That way we can be sure your burning questions are answered by our amazing panelists. Thank you again for joining us today and for participating in this critical discussion. Now, please welcome Nikki Lewis, the National Policy Campaign Director for One Fair Wage.
Hi, thank you so much, Amy, for having me on. Shout out, big thank you to you and everyone at the Riveter, to the United States of Women, to Time's Up and Emily's List for joining us today and being co-host for this event. My name is Nikki Lewis. I recently got married though, so you may also know me as Nikki Cole, whatever. I'm Nikki. Thanks for having me. And I myself was a tipped worker for over a decade. And it's a real honor to be someone who organizes and advocates for other tip servers, tip service workers in the industry today. During my tenure as a service worker, I definitely lived tip to mouth, day to day, very precariously. I endured a lot of sexual harassment, didn't have any kind of health care or workplace benefits. I went through some things. I also didn't have access to unemployment insurance when I couldn't work. And so the fact that we are doing this fund today to provide relief to people who are in situations similar to mine is really important. And I'm just so grateful to the people I'm about to introduce further for their long work of service and advocacy to help people like myself. First and foremost, I want to more deeply introduce Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton. She is the main draw of why you are here today. Thanks to everyone for joining us. As you know, she has spent 4 decades in public service as an advocate, attorney, First Lady, U.S. Senator, U.S. Secretary of State, and presidential candidate. As the 67th U.S. Secretary of State, her approach to foreign policy repositioned American diplomacy and development for the 21st century. Clinton played a central role in restoring America's standing in the world, reasserting the United States as a Pacific power, imposing crippling sanctions on Iran and North Korea, responding to the Arab awakening, and negotiating a ceasefire in the Middle East. Earlier, as First Lady and Senator of New York, she traveled to more than 80 countries as a champion for human rights, democracy, and opportunities for women and girls. Clinton also worked to provide health care to millions, create jobs and opportunity, and support first responders who risk their lives at ground zero. In her historic 2016 campaign for President of the United States, Clinton won 66 million votes. She is married to former US President Bill Clinton, has one daughter, Chelsea, and 3 grandchildren, Charlotte, Edith, and Jasper. Welcome, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Pleasure to have you. And I also want to give a warm welcome to Saru Jayaraman, my boss and one of my heroes. She is the president of One Fair Wage, the co-founder of the Restaurant Opportunity Center, or Rock United, and the director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Saru has spent the last 20 years organizing and advocating for raising wages and working conditions for restaurant and other service workers. Saru is a graduate of Yale Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She is listed in CNN's top 10 visionary women and recognized as a champion of change by the White House in 2014. She is also a James Beard Foundation Leadership Awardee in 2015 and a San Francisco Chronicle Visionary for the year 2019. Saru authored Behind the Kitchen Door, a national bestseller, also Forked, a new standard for American dining that came out in 2016, and most recently Bite Back, coming out this year, and has also appeared on MSNBC, HBO, PBS, CBS, and CNN. She's attended the Golden Globes in January 2018 with Amy Poehler as part of the Time's Up action to address sexual harassment. And Saru lives with her 2 daughters and husband in Oakland, California. Welcome, Saru.
Thank you.
So Saru, just to start us off with this conversation, I was hoping you could explain a little bit more about the issues facing tipped workers before and after coronavirus to get this conversation going.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and thank you, Secretary Clinton. Thank you so much for joining us and uplifting these important issues. We so deeply appreciate it. I want to thank our partners, the Riveter, United States of Women, Emily's List, and Time's Up. And I want to thank our donors and board members, Virginia McGregor, Robert Raymer, and Wanda Hamoud for helping to make this happen as well. As Nikki mentioned, I run a research center at the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy and have been looking at the service sector for the last really 20 years. What we knew before coronavirus is that the restaurant industry has been one of the largest and the #1 fastest growing sector of the US economy, with almost 14 million workers right before the pandemic shut us down. But it's also been the lowest paying for generations. And that is largely because of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which is currently, unfortunately, just $2.13 an hour. This sub-minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States is a literal legacy of slavery. The first tipped workers in the United States to receive a non-wage or a sub-minimum wage were newly freed slaves after emancipation, and the restaurant lobby wanted to pay them nothing and have them live on tips. And that became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when every tipped worker got a $0 minimum wage from their boss as long as tips brought them to the full minimum wage. And we went from 0 in 1938 as part of the New Deal to $2.13 an hour in 2020. Today, 70% of tipped workers are women, 40% are single mothers. The restaurant industry is the largest employer of women in the United States and is still allowed to pay workers as little as $2.13 an hour. 43 states continue with this legacy of a sub-minimum wage. And these women face both the highest levels of economic instability and sexual harassment of any industry because they're having to tolerate all this inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families in tips. There are 7 states, including California, where I live, that require a full minimum wage with tips on top to all workers, including tipped workers. And we find that those 7 states not only have faster growing restaurant industries and job growth, but also they have 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry as the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And that differential became painfully clear with the pandemic. So when COVID-19 hit, we saw 10 million service workers lose their jobs. And sadly, about 60% of them are reporting that they are ineligible or being denied for unemployment insurance. Now, there's definitely a population within that 60% that are immigrants and that aren't going to get access to any benefits because of their immigration status. There's also a very large percentage, majority in fact, of that 60% that is telling us that they are being denied unemployment insurance at the state level because their sub-minimum wage of $2 or $3 or whatever it is in their state, plus tips, is too little to meet the minimum threshold in their state to qualify for benefits. And although Congress has passed some unemployment insurance to overcome that, many of these workers are reporting that when their states deny them unemployment insurance because their wages are so low, they're not then able to access the federal. And so the sub-minimum wage that was a problem before the coronavirus has become much more of a problem for millions of women across the country with children, trying to feed their families with no income and no benefits. And it's really a crisis of, I would say, depression era level poverty and starvation. And at the same time, we see hundreds of thousands of small business restaurants that have closed, at least half of them at risk of not coming back. And that also means that there's going to be much longer unemployment in our sector than the pandemic, than the length of the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Saru, for breaking that down for us. I want to ask Secretary Clinton, there's a lot of people being impacted by the COVID-19 epidemic right now. But before we talk more about the fund, why do you think this issue in particular is important for people to know about?
Well, thank you, Nikki. And thanks to Saru and everybody at One Fair Wage. And thank you, Emmy and the Riveter and all the other sponsors, because I would bet even among the people who tuned in to see us, many have never heard of the sub-minimum wage, the tipped wage, until you and Saru just described it. I think that probably many millions of Americans don't understand or have never been informed that oftentimes the people who are taking care of them at restaurants and other businesses are surviving literally on tips because it is legal for their employer to pay them as little as $2.13 an hour. So I thank One Fair Wage for elevating this issue. And of course, it's so important to do that now because as difficult as circumstances were before the pandemic, they're a crisis now for many millions of service workers who have lost their jobs, who, as you just said, are not even eligible for unemployment compensation. So we have a crisis. We have a crisis where millions of workers, predominantly women, were barely scraping by before. Now their jobs are gone. The businesses that employed them are gone. The people they served who would tip them are gone. They're having a hard time feeding their families. They don't know what they're going to do when the rent and foreclosure waivers begin to be lifted, which I hope is not anytime soon. They're literally on the brink of total financial disaster. So what we all believe, those who support One Fair Wage, is that we have to deal with the immediate emergency. But that's not enough. We also need to take advantage of this terrible crisis to educate people so that when we do come back from what is a joint economic and health crisis, we can do better than we were before. We can make the changes in laws and regulations and attitudes that will really recognize that we have to do more to help those who are literally serving us day in and day out. So I want very much to support the emergency campaign that you will describe, because I think a lot of people watching, and I hope they will tell many more people, can do something to help alleviate the financial catastrophe that unfortunately affects too many of our tipped wage workers right now, but also to begin to think of ways in solidarity with those workers, with groups like One Fair Wage, to try to fix this situation. And as Saru just said, there are 7 states that have recognized that this is so fundamentally unfair. This vestige of slavery needs to be eliminated once and for all. And a lot of the states, based on all of the evidence, California being the foremost largest state, have shown that getting rid of tipped wage and moving toward a much fairer minimum wage is going to not only help workers, but it doesn't hurt the businesses that employ those workers. They actually continue to do well. In fact, based on a lot of evidence, even better than before. So I'm grateful for this chance to lend my voice on behalf of these workers and on behalf of this emergency fund.
Thanks. Thank you.
We're certainly grateful for you lending your voice towards this effort as well. Saru, can you explain to folks in about a minute, what is the One Fair Wage Emergency Fund? How does it work?
Yeah, thank you so much. So we started the One Fair Wage Emergency Fund for service workers on March 16th. And since then, we've received almost 170,000 applications from relief. 170,000 workers have applied. We have raised almost $21 million in relief for these workers, but it's obviously not enough. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket, even compared to our 170,000 workers, or if you think about the 10 million workers who've lost their jobs, we have a long way to go. With the help of about 1,000 volunteers who've signed up on the website, we've been distributing cash payments of about $500 per worker. We've been prioritizing workers who have dependents and don't have access to other benefits like unemployment insurance. Some donors have requested that their funds go to specific geographic locations. I want to support, workers in Tucson, or I want to support workers in New York, and we've managed to make that happen. But one of the most important things, as Secretary Clinton just said, is that the fund has created an opportunity to bring workers together with their supporters and allies to demand more. And so we've been using the fact that workers have been coming to us in the thousands to organize large teletown halls with their elected officials to voice their needs and concerns, the problems they're having with the system, and the fact that they never should have been paid a sub-minimum wage to begin with. So the fund is an immediate relief, as Secretary Clinton has said, but it's also been an opportunity to elevate and to organize these workers to lift up their voices for change.
Thank you, Saru. And Secretary Clinton, as you heard Saru say, we've raised 21 million in relief so far. Why do you think it's important that people still can continue to contribute to this fund?
Well, as great as that is, 21 million, 170,000 applicants, there are so many more people who need help, especially when you stop to think that so many of these service workers are not eligible for unemployment compensation. So they're not even getting the help that Congress has passed, that it's administered through states, that so many other workers are eligible for. So although it's an incredibly important effort that has shown a lot of success so far, I think that everybody who looks at the facts and the millions of workers who are at risk has to conclude that we need to do much more. And I want to really applaud One Fair Wage, you, Saru, and others for using this moment to help educate people, particularly the panel discussions, the town halls, reaching out to elected officials, because as I said earlier, this is still not as well known as it needs to be. You all have done an amazing job raising the visibility of the fact that millions of Americans are legally getting a sub-minimum wage, but a lot of our fellow Americans still don't know. So the emergency fund is a way for everybody to join in to help these workers get through this tough time. I don't know when we're going to be reopened across the country. I don't know what businesses are going to survive. As you said earlier, some of these businesses are not going to survive, which means that the livelihood and jobs of some of the very people we're talking about is going to disappear unless they can get another job. So we're just at the beginning of trying to deal with the real legitimate needs of these people who have worked hard, often under, as you described, Nikki, in your own story, for 10 years, difficult circumstances. I lasted one day as a server in a restaurant, and I was so appalled at the behavior that was being demonstrated toward my fellow servers, toward the people in the kitchen, that I literally, walked away. But I could afford to do that. And a lot of people, particularly a lot of women, cannot afford to do that. So let's seize this moment as a moment of solidarity. All of us are at home. Those that are still going out to work deserve even more of our support, because at this very moment, some of those sub-minimum wage workers are still working.
That's right.
They're helping to hand out food at the corner when the car stops. They are delivering food. And so there still is an ongoing workforce that, unless there's been a big change of attitude, are still getting sub-minimum wage, unless you tip that person that hands you the food at your door or at your car. So this is a problem that is still going on, that still affects millions of Americans, those still working, a small minority, and those who have lost their jobs. And I just think it's time for Americans to show that, we hear this, we understand this, and we're going to do something about it.
Well, I've been ready to do something about it, and I'm curious to know what you both think, Secretary Clinton and Saru. What do you think is possible for the future of the restaurant industry, and how can we all help make that a reality? Saru, let's start with you.
Yeah, one thing I do want to say, and I really echo what Secretary Clinton said in terms of we need change. Like, this moment is a moment for change. And the most gratifying part of the last 8 weeks has been a lot of donors, a lot of consumers, a lot of legislators saying, we recognize that there was a problem. We're seeing it now in the millions of people who are being laid off and nothing, that we're living tip to mouth. But we're also seeing it in employers who, many of whom had opposed us on this issue in the past, maybe thought differently, and have now kind of really felt like maybe we can align. And part of the reason why employers are shifting their stance, what we're seeing is that several employers are shifting their stance on this issue, is that a lot of them are feeling like, well, my whole business model has been blown up. There's an opportunity to start from scratch and maybe do things very differently. And so we have been wanting to support and encourage those employers that are thinking differently. And so one example of this is a program we launched with Governor Gavin Newsom in California and the Secretary of Labor in California, Julie Su, called High Road Kitchens, where we were able to provide a combination of public and private dollars to provide cash grants to restaurants that commit to livable wages and greater equity next year, in order to this year rehire workers and repurpose them as community kitchens, feeding thousands of unemployed workers and others. So we're hoping to replicate that program in New York and Michigan and many other states. But it's just one example of how we can support restaurants that are increasingly open to something different, a new model, a better model. And part of that is that we've got a petition that you can find at our website, onefairwage.org, to sign for One Fair Wage, to encourage more employers to think differently. But there's a lot that we all can do to say, we want to support the restaurant industry. We want to make sure small businesses survive, and we want to make sure workers can survive. And so that means helping businesses move to not only survive, but move to a new and better and more resilient business model.
Thank you. Secretary Clinton, thoughts?
Well, I agree with Saru that this is the moment to be creative, innovative. I love the program that you are doing in California with the governor and the labor secretary. It's a new model. It demonstrates some creative thinking about how to not only support workers, but also make it possible for small and medium-sized businesses to get back into business, to keep going. And it serves a population that often needs to have those meals available to them. So it's a win-win on all levels. And I would like to see more creative thinking along those lines. When we finally find our way out of this double whammy health and economic crisis, we all have to be more creative. And we have to recognize some very basic facts. The United States economy is a consumer-driven economy. That's where the jobs come from, people buying goods and services. And if the 90% of the consumers in this country don't have adequate income, then the economy cannot recover, the economy cannot grow, more jobs cannot be created. I hope that that lesson has penetrated because too often people think wrongly that jobs come from the top, and that is just not the case. We have learned over and over again that unless there is spending going on at the base of the economy by working people that then can drive demand, then can create new jobs, nothing done from the top to trickle down is going to have a lasting impact. So I hope people reorient their thinking coming out of this crisis. You know, the most important thing is to keep people working at good paying jobs that can support a family, that can provide a path forward. And really the government should be thinking about ways to support employment. I would like us to move toward a full employment system, not an unemployment system that only kicks in when the worst has happened and doesn't even cover everybody, as we have just discussed. So this is a real opportunity if we can get not just leaders in government, but leaders across all of society, in the economy, in the nonprofit, in the organizing community, everybody, the faith community, everybody coming together saying, let's try some different things. You know, it used to be said that the states were the laboratories of democracy, and the One Fair Wage campaign has been successful in 7 states. Other states should look at the facts. You know, I'm kind of pro-facts and pro-evidence. Let's look at the facts. And if you look at the facts, you know, moving away from the vestige of slavery that tipped wages are, to the minimum wage, eliminating the sub-minimum tipped wage, has not hurt. It has, in fact, helped. It has created a more competitive restaurant environment. So I'm, you know, hopeful. I try to be optimistic, even in the worst of times. I am hopeful that with leadership from groups like yours and from many of those who are supporting you in all walks of life, more and more people will say, hey, we don't want to go back to where we were. We want to come back better and stronger and make this an economy that works for everybody. And there's no better place to start than eliminating tipped wages.
Thank you so much, Secretary Clinton. We are grateful for your time, for your leadership, for your example of being a powerful woman. We do have a couple of questions from folks, if you're able to still join us. One question that we have from a panel or from a guest today is, besides tipping and safely patronizing local businesses, what are some things we can do from home to support these workers? What are the most impactful things we can do while still in quarantine and practicing social distancing?
Let me take that before I have to sign off, Nikki, because you're doing it right now to the questioner by tuning in, by listening to what One Fair Wage is telling you. I hope by donating to the emergency fund for workers, but you can also do it by sharing what you're learning with your friends and your colleagues. Because again, I'll underscore, a lot of people won't really know about tipped wage disparities and the real burden it puts on workers like you, Nikki, unless someone like the questioner spreads the word. So please do that. Also, if you are getting takeout, which a lot of people are because we get bored with our own cooking, honestly, so we're patronizing takeout. You know, think about those people on the front lines in those restaurants who are doing that takeout. Tip them, you know, be fair to them. It's the same with our grocery store workers who are on the front lines. You know, our frontline workers, in addition to our healthcare workers, are predominantly women. You know, 80% of all healthcare workers in America are women. And as we've already heard, a very high majority percentage of service workers, whether they be in restaurants or in other settings, are women as well. So think about them and their families. Think about them getting up every day to go to work, probably scared because they know that venturing out of their home carries a risk. And think about them as you get that takeout and maybe, provide a little extra for the people who are there serving you and your family. And Nikki, the final thing I want to say is please vote. I say it all the time, and I know the rest of us who do, sometimes people's eyes roll. Everybody wants to do something right now to help, and I'm all for that. You can volunteer at a kitchen that's feeding people who are literally lined up for miles to get some food because they can't afford it. But don't forget to vote. We've got elections coming up this month and next month. Obviously, we got elections in August, September, and then the big election in November. It really matters whether you vote for people who see what we see, who care about what we care about. So I would argue you got to vote in every election, because a lot of these decisions about whether or not there's going to be tipped wages in a state are decided at the state level. Your state legislator is the one who's making that decision. So every single election is important. And when it comes to an issue like this, which is so critical in the lives of millions and millions and millions of our fellow Americans, think of them when you go to vote. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Secretary Clinton. We appreciate you.
Saru.
Yes, thank you so much, folks. You just heard from the one, the only Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton. Thank you for tuning in. And we still have a couple of more questions for folks. We'll pop it to Saru and then we'll wrap up, because we do value people time. But we had two more questions here, so I'm just going to ask them to you both. Someone wants to know, what is the average annual income of sub-minimum wage workers? And then also, how and why do we still tip as a society? It seems economically and socially irrational. We don't tip professors, bus drivers, nurses, cashiers. Why only a select few?
I'll quickly wrap up because I know Amy's going to come in here now. So just to say, we know that tipped workers suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce. Typically, their incomes are in the range of $15,000 to $20,000 annually. This is what women have been living on prior to the pandemic. And it's true. This is the only industry, we tip in a lot of sectors, but this is the only industry in which you might actually see that people are paid less because of tips. And it's because it's a majority female industry that, we've allowed as a country this wage to stay at $2. I just want to say one last thing, which is there is a way to actually both help the moment and the election and the future through our fund. You can not only contribute, you can click on the volunteer button on the ofwemergencyfund.org, because every volunteer calls these workers, helps to screen to get checks out, but also helps them register to vote. So we can help these 170,000 workers who've come to us for relief and growing, not only get checks, but also vote in this important election. So thank you, Amy. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, everybody, for being with us.
Thank you so much, Saru, and thank you so much, Nikki, and One Fair Wage, and thank you all for joining us today. And please, one more time, go to www.ofwemergencyfund.org to donate, to volunteer, or to find resources, or to do all of those. This is so important. And so please tell your friends and family, talk about it on social media. This is up to all of us, and together we can make change. Thank you again.